Gods and Archetypes. That's our topic. And we start with a pretty bold statement. This is from the Corpus Hermeticum, Book 10. Indeed, if we have to speak the truth boldly, the true man is above the gods, or at least fully equal in power. Not one of the heavenly gods will leave the boundaries of heaven and come down to earth, but man ascends to heaven and measures it. And he knows the high from the low, and he understands all the other things there exactly. And even more amazing, he ascends while not leaving the earth. So great is his range. Thus one may say that man on earth is a mortal god, and that the heavenly God is an immortal man. That's from Book 10. Pardon the gendered language, by the way. So let's unpack this a little bit. And we should start by a reminder that I've mentioned in previous videos that nous, or creative consciousness, connects us directly with big mystery, according to the Hermetic way of holding all this. So direct experiential gnosis link to the intelligence of the cosmos. And that is something that the gods don't have. Now, if we think about gods for a moment through a Jungian lens, of course, we would say archetypes. And Jung begins by saying that archetypes are these universal patterns: death, rebirth, sacred marriage, mother, father, and so on. The heavens themselves are an archetype, the earth. And that the archetypes are kind of like organs of the psyche. We're born with them. And later in Jung's work, he starts speculating that the archetypes are not just in human beings, they're in primates and maybe even insects, and maybe even the world itself. So I'm thinking of Huron Legrais and Rick Tarnas and a number of other people who have pushed that even farther and say the patterns that we're looking at as primal are actually the kind of the structural forces of the cosmos itself. So archetypes as patterns of potentiality, as something that's not a noun that you can actually measure, but is more like a literary theme that comes up over and over again, whether on earth or in the heavens or elsewhere. So if we think about archetypes that way, then it seems apparent that we can both identify with and disidentify with them. So, you know, somebody who falls in love may think of themselves as just completely possessed by Venus or one of the other romantic love deities. They're found all over the world, take your pick. You know, possessed by whoever, Aphrodite, Venus, Enya, any of the others. And so in a state of archetypal possession, we lose our discernment and we become basically a vehicle for the archetype to express itself. Jung talks about it in an interview as though we were having a seizure of some kind. So what the Hermetic teaching is giving us is the sense that we can disidentify as well when an archetype shows up and tries to possess us. That we actually have a connection to what is beyond the archetypes, beyond the gods. An idea that is potentially blasphemous and is in terms of some religions. But if we ponder it for a little bit, it gives us some interesting tools to work with. So if we think of, you know, I'm going to use gods and archetypes interchangeably here. What are the gods for? If they're not just in us, what are they for? And the Hermetic response would be they regulate the universe. They're the principles that we see operating everywhere, including the way that the stars, the planets, and everything else are in motion around us. Motion was a key motif in Hermeticism, and they got that part from Plato. And so archetypes everywhere, organizing everything. A few, you could think of it fractally, a few basic motifs or images creating endless diversity all around us. That seems to be how the cosmic blueprint works. Another way of looking at this is that archetypes are, or gods, are sentient natural forces. Zeus is the higher view of things. Osiris is death and rebirth. Osiris is the seed that goes into the ground and dies so that something can sprout. Isis is the caretaker and mother of every family that existed everywhere in every configuration. So this way of looking at archetypes brings them to some extent into our reality, even though, like I said earlier, they can't actually be pinned down and measured because they're processes rather than nouns. So the idea in Hermeticism is that there are some of these powers, and they often are described as celestial powers, but they exist on Earth too. Some of these archetypal powers can be good, evil, mixed, depending on their activity. So there is no sense of an entirely benevolent fatherly deity in Hermeticism. What manifests, it depends on how we face a god or archetype, however you want to say it, that pops up for us, that shows up for us. So how all this goes is through the lens of activity. And I'll give you a quotation from Corpus Hermeticum, book 16. For the essence of a spiritual power is its activity. And so this activity can shape our souls after themselves. There was an idea that when we're born, the planetary gods in particular organize who we are, and our natal charts reflect that. So there's a big astrological piece in Hermeticism. Not causal, I'll keep saying that as we go, more like synchronicity. But the gods shape our souls, they arouse our souls through our bodies, but they don't fully control us. And so I'm reminded here of Jung's comment where he says that when an archetype is constellated, it's up to us to decide how to face it. So let's switch to Gnostic language for a second to get a feel for this. The Gnostics differentiated between powers, archetypal powers that they called archons and aeons. And I sometimes think of archons as being the shadows, the power shadows of aeons. So aeons are similar in some ways to angels, and that word was used at times. It was imported from Zoroastrian angelology. Aeons are both emanations of the ultimate mystery and also beings, and they have archetypal names. So they're called things like insight or discernment, things like that. So in general, and there's exceptions, Gnostic literature, which should never be taken too literally, by the way, as the Gnostics themselves warn us, tends to think of aeons as more like benevolent powers, and archons, which are often equated to the planets, with the planets, they're more shadowy. Their agenda is to keep us asleep, as the Gnostic tales tell us. They want us under control. And so if you were to bring a Gnostic forward, an original Gnostic forward through 2,000 years and educate them about the world, they would be able to point right and left and say, these land-swallowing malignant corporations on this side, and these oppressive tyrannical governments, and these vast armies, and these social media systems are archontic. They're possessed by archons. And there's a thought that, and I'm thinking of April DeConnick's work, there's a thought that Paul himself probably wasn't, he wasn't so much a Gnostic as somebody who was writing and reflecting and studying at a time before Gnosticism was really separate from everything else that was going on around the time of Christ. And so there's a famous passage that has the flavor that we're looking for. And Paul says, we struggle not against flesh, but against powers, against principalities, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So that's the flavor of archons, according to a Gnostic way of holding it, as well as Paul's. So it's not about human beings and controlling people or killing people in you know, in war or anything like that. It's more about seeing through to what's actually controlling them and taking measures. So in terms of dealing with these archontic, aeonic, celestial, whatever we want to call them, archetypal powers, the message in the Hermetica is that we need some tools. So one of them is discernment. We need to understand what's up for us. We need to understand what archetypal situation we're in at a given moment. And one way of doing that is just to familiarize yourself with basic themes and existential themes. You know, or am I in a death rebirth situation right now? I went through a 3-year period where that it seemed like that's all I was in. So, and there's other things too. Am I in a time of being a seeker? Am I in some other archetypal time? So discernment, figuring out what's happening that's bigger than you are, that has caught you, right? Taking up a stand toward that moment, toward that field that has you in its grip. Receiving the gifts of whatever archetypal power is up for you, because they all have some. Archons are described fairly negatively in the Gnostic literature, but there's also the thought that they have something to offer us. And in the rest of the Hermetica, they're thought of actually as more like threshold guardians. They're there to test us and challenge us, and they have things for us to learn. And at best, when something archontic pops up, we take back some of its force. We take the blessing of it, the gift that it has to offer, and that takes it out of action. And so we see through the situation to the powers that are operating, and that will start to help us deal with them, receive the gifts, and move on. And so there are several places in the Gnostic texts where Gnostic Jesus advises, be passersby. Don't get stuck in a particular archetypal situation. So something to take away from all this is that in spite of all the things that control us, whether we think of them as just ordinary historical events, cultural events, archetypal events, whatever it is, what our life is, according to the Hermetic way of understanding, is in our grasp, mind, heart, and soul.